Taylor's routine day at the luxury boutique is disrupted by a casually dressed girl, but little does she know this one customer will change her life and her job forever. Don't forget to hit that like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's dive into the story. The bell above the door chimed softly as another potential customer entered, Silverline Fashion. Taylor didn't look up right away. She was in the middle of arranging a new display of handbags, each one worth more than her weekly paycheck. She prided herself on making everything look perfect, symmetrical, elegant, and expensive. Presentation was everything in the store, and Taylor knew that her future in fashion depended on impressing the right people. Silverline wasn't your average boutique. Located in one of the city's most elite shopping districts, it catered to those with taste, class, and, most importantly, money. Taylor had worked there for nearly a year, and in that time, she had learned the unspoken rules of the store. Cater to the wealthy, ignore the rest. It wasn't in the handbook, but it was a survival tactic. Her manager, Mrs. Simmons, often reminded the staff that their clientele expected the best. "We're not just selling clothes, we're selling a lifestyle," Mrs. Simmons liked to say. Taylor had taken that to heart. So, when she finally glanced up and saw a girl about her own age walking in, dressed in worn-out sneakers, faded jeans, and a hoodie that looked a little too big for her, Taylor didn't even try to hide her disappointment. The girl looked so out of place in this gleaming palace of luxury. The walls were lined with soft leather bags, silken scarves, and dresses that shimmered under the recessed lighting, all practically screaming exclusivity. And then there was this girl, looking like she had wandered in by mistake. Taylor's mind immediately jumped to a conclusion. This girl wasn't going to buy anything. She was probably just here to browse, to kill time before going somewhere else. Taylor had seen it before. Students or tourists who came in just to experience the high-end lifestyle without actually contributing to it. They'd leave empty-handed, having wasted the clerk's time, and that was the last thing Taylor needed today. She barely made eye contact as she called out, "Can I help you?" in a tone that was more obligatory than welcoming. She quickly went back to adjusting the handbags, mentally preparing herself for the likelihood that this girl would hang around too long, touch too many things, and ultimately leave without buying a single item. The girl didn't respond right away. Instead, she wandered over to a rack of dresses, trailing her fingers lightly along the fabrics. She didn't seem to notice Taylor's disinterest, or if she did, she didn't show it. She picked up a pale blue silk dress, holding it up to her shoulders and inspecting herself in the mirror. Taylor bit her lip to keep from sighing audibly. Of all the dresses, she thought, she picks one of the most expensive ones in the store. She stole a glance at the price tag. $2,500. No way could this girl afford that, Taylor told herself. It would probably take her months just to save up for something like this, if she even worked at all. A second customer entered the store, this one draped in a designer trench coat and carrying a bag that Taylor instantly recognized as a limited edition Hermes. Her entire demeanor changed. This was the kind of customer she was looking for, the type who could spend thousands in a single visit without blinking. With the kind of enthusiasm she had reserved for the elite, Taylor offered a warm, genuine smile and stepped forward. "Welcome to Silverline," she said, her voice carrying a sweetness that had been missing just moments earlier. "Can I show you some of our newest arrivals? We just got in a beautiful collection of scarves that would pair perfectly with your coat." The wealthy customer smiled and nodded, clearly appreciating the attention. Taylor's mind raced with thoughts of her sales commission and the potential bonus she could earn if she hit her monthly target. As she led the woman to a display of scarves, she felt a sense of satisfaction, the kind that came from knowing you were doing exactly what was expected of you. After all, wasn't this her job? To cater to the people who could actually afford to shop here? Meanwhile, the casually dressed girl was still lingering by the dresses, seemingly oblivious to the fact that Taylor had all but forgotten about her. She held up another dress, this one a deep green velvet gown, and studied it carefully. Taylor resisted the urge to roll her eyes. She was sure the girl didn't know anything about real fashion, about what it took to pull off a look like that. Minutes passed, and Taylor was fully immersed in assisting her wealthy customer, explaining the craftsmanship behind the silk scarves, the hand-stitched details, and the limited availability of each item. The rich woman listened, clearly enjoying the experience, and eventually selected a scarf priced at $800, which she added to her other luxury finds. As Taylor rang up the purchase, the casually dressed girl approached the counter, the green velvet gown draped over her arm. She waited patiently as Taylor finished processing the transaction for her preferred customer, but Taylor didn't acknowledge her right away. She was still riding the high of a successful sale, her mind already thinking ahead to how many more she could close before the end of the week. When she finally turned to the girl, she barely masked her impatience. "Yes?" The girl held up the gown, her voice soft but clear. "Do you have this in a different color?" Taylor didn't even bother checking the stock on the computer. "No," she said flatly. "That's the only one we have left." The girl hesitated for a moment, as if she didn't believe her, but she nodded and quietly placed the gown back on the rack. Taylor didn't give her a second thought. The wealthy customer was leaving, and Taylor hurried to the door to thank her, offering her a business card in case she wanted to make future purchases. She was all smiles, her mood elevated by the success of the sale. Behind her, the casually dressed girl stood by the dresses for a moment longer before silently heading toward the door. As she left, the bell above the door chimed again, just as softly as when she had entered. Taylor didn't bother saying goodbye. To her, the girl had been invisible, just another face in the background of her day, a day that, in her mind, had gone pretty well. Little did she know, that small moment of indifference would soon come back to haunt her. The afternoon sun streamed through the large glass windows of the boutique, casting long golden streaks across the polished floor. Taylor leaned against the counter, feeling a sense of accomplishment after assisting the well-to-do customer. She mentally calculated her commission from the scarf sale, already imagining herself celebrating with a fancy dinner that weekend. She loved these moments, when everything seemed to click into place, her charm working on high-end clients who appreciated her attention to detail. As she basked in her small victory, the bell chimed again, but this time it wasn't another customer entering. The sound, so soft and easy to ignore, signaled that the casually dressed girl hadn't left after all. She was still inside. Taylor glanced over and saw her hovering near the rack of velvet gowns, deep in thought. It was like the girl was in her own world, oblivious to the unwritten rule that customers who didn't look the part weren't supposed to linger. A small twinge of annoyance crept into Taylor's chest. She was about to start restocking some accessories when she saw the girl heading back toward the counter, the same green velvet dress draped over her arm again. Taylor bit her lip, frustrated that she would have to deal with this girl after all. There was no way this girl could afford anything in the store, let alone one of their most expensive gowns. She sighed internally, composing herself just enough to maintain some semblance of professionalism. If the girl kept asking questions, Taylor figured she could subtly nudge her toward leaving the store without making a scene. There were ways to make people feel unwelcome without outright telling them to leave. And besides, she had much better things to do than babysit someone who clearly didn't fit in here. The girl approached the counter, holding up the dress. Her expression was thoughtful, her eyes scanning the delicate fabric, as though she genuinely appreciated the craftsmanship of the piece. She hesitated before speaking, as if unsure whether to bother Taylor again. "Excuse me," she said, her voice almost apologetic. "I know you said this is the only one left, but could you check if maybe you have it in another color, or even in a different size?" Taylor suppressed the urge to sigh. She gave the girl a brief, impatient glance. "Like I said before, we don't have any more. This is the last one," she replied, her voice flat, not bothering to look up from the catalog she had just opened. The girl's fingers tightened around the dress's hanger, her face flickering with a hint of disappointment. For a moment, it seemed like she was about to say something more, but she stopped herself. Instead, she offered a small, polite nod. "Oh, okay," she murmured. "Thank you." Taylor's mind was already wandering elsewhere as the girl moved away from the counter. A small part of her felt a brief sting of guilt at how cold she had been, but she quickly rationalized it. It wasn't like this girl was going to buy anything. What was the point of wasting time on someone who couldn't contribute to her sales? She had better things to focus on, like the possibility of another high-end client walking in. As the minutes ticked by, Taylor returned to her task of organizing scarves, carefully folding each one to perfection. She had long since forgotten about the girl still lingering in the store. Every now and then, she stole a glance at the door, hoping to see someone who belonged at Silverline walking in. The casual girl, however, wasn't finished browsing. She moved slowly through the store, her fingers grazing the luxurious fabrics, the gleam in her eyes one of quiet admiration. She didn't rush or hurry through her exploration of the racks and shelves. It was as if she was savoring every moment, like a child wandering through a candy store, taking in every detail. But to Taylor, her presence was a distraction, a reminder of someone who was taking up space without adding any value. Finally, the girl made her way back to the accessories section, where Taylor stood folding scarves with precision. The girl's gaze fell on a delicate silver necklace displayed in a glass case, her eyes lighting up as though she had found something truly special. For a moment, Taylor felt a twinge of surprise. The necklace wasn't one of the most expensive pieces in the store, but it was still a luxury item. Maybe the girl would ask about it, Taylor thought, half-heartedly considering whether she should put any effort into her response. The girl leaned in slightly, as if inspecting the necklace more closely. "This is beautiful," she said softly, almost to herself. Taylor glanced up briefly, uninterested. The girl looked like she was about to ask more questions, but before she could, Taylor's focus shifted. She saw Mrs. Simmons, the store manager, walking into the boutique from the back office. Immediately, Taylor stood up straighter, her posture changing as though a switch had flipped. Mrs. Simmons was always impeccably dressed, her poised figure wrapped in a tailored blazer and heels that clicked against the floor with authority. She was a woman with a reputation to uphold, and she expected her staff to mirror that elegance. The casually dressed girl noticed Mrs. Simmons too, but her reaction was different. A smile tugged at the corners of her lips, and her entire demeanor softened. She abandoned the necklace and moved toward Mrs. Simmons with a familiarity that immediately confused Taylor. "Hey, Aunt Clara," the girl said warmly, her voice filled with affection. Taylor's heart stopped. "Aunt Clara?" Mrs. Simmons' face lit up with a wide smile as she approached the girl, arms open. "Emma, darling, what a surprise," she said, pulling the girl into a tight hug. The air in the boutique seemed to shift, the casual warmth between them transforming the entire mood. Taylor's stomach twisted into knots. "Emma? Aunt Clara?" Suddenly, everything felt like it was moving in slow motion as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The girl in the hoodie, the one she had dismissed and ignored, was Mrs. Simmons' niece. She was part of the family who owned Silverline, the very people who had the power to decide her fate at this store. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched them interact. They weren't just acquaintances. Emma and Mrs. Simmons clearly had a close relationship, one that made Taylor's earlier assumptions feel more ridiculous by the second. How could she have been so blind? She had spent the entire afternoon dismissing Emma, treating her like she didn't matter. And now it was clear that Emma was far more important than any customer Taylor had ever dealt with. Mrs. Simmons turned toward Taylor, her smile fading slightly as she noticed the tension in the air. Her sharp eyes flicked between her niece and her employee, clearly sensing something was off. "Emma," she said gently, "did you find anything you liked today? Was Taylor able to help you?" Emma hesitated for a second, glancing at Taylor. There was no malice in her eyes, just a quiet understanding of what had transpired. "Not really," Emma said softly, trying to keep her tone light. "But it's okay." Mrs. Simmons' expression darkened ever so slightly, her attention turning toward Taylor now. The look in her eyes was unreadable, but Taylor felt her chest tighten with panic. She could feel the weight of her manager's unspoken disappointment settling over her like a heavy cloak. Taylor stood frozen behind the counter, her hands trembling ever so slightly as the weight of the situation sank in. Emma, the casually dressed girl she had dismissed so easily, was Mrs. Simmons's niece. Not just any random customer, not someone who didn't belong, but a member of the family that owned Silverline Fashion. The same family that could decide her future at the boutique. The room suddenly felt too small, the air thick with an awkwardness that Taylor couldn't escape. Emma glanced back at her, offering a small, polite smile, but it wasn't the type of smile that put Taylor at ease. If anything, it only made her feel worse. Emma wasn't angry or confrontational, she didn't need to be. The fact that she wasn't making a scene just made Taylor's guilt swell even more. Mrs. Simmons, always composed and sharp-eyed, noticed the awkward exchange. Her smile, which had been warm just moments ago, faded as she turned her attention fully to Taylor. "Taylor," she began, her voice calm but pointed, "did you assist Emma today?" Taylor's heart pounded so loudly in her ears she almost couldn't hear the words. She tried to respond, but her mouth felt dry and her voice wavered as she spoke. Yes, I did." Mrs. Simmons raised an eyebrow. "Did you show her anything she liked, or help her with any requests?" Taylor felt like she was shrinking. She knew that if she admitted to how dismissive she had been, it would look even worse. She had been cold, uninterested, and downright rude to Emma, actions that up until a few minutes ago she thought were harmless. Now, though, every interaction replayed in her mind, each one making her stomach churn. Emma, sensing the tension, stepped in before Taylor could answer. "It's okay, Aunt Clara," she said softly, her voice gentle and kind. "I didn't really find what I was looking for anyway." Her eyes flicked toward Taylor for a split second, but there was no malice there. Just an understanding that felt even more humiliating to Taylor. Emma wasn't going to call her out, even though she had every right to. Mrs. Simmons, however, wasn't convinced. She knew her niece well enough to see through her attempt to smooth things over. She took a step closer to Emma, resting a hand on her shoulder in a familiar, affectionate gesture before turning back to Taylor. "Emma's very kind," she said slowly, her voice sharp now, "but I expect all of my employees to treat every customer, whether they're family or not, with the same respect and attentiveness." Taylor's face burned with shame. She opened her mouth to respond, to try and explain herself, but no words came. What could she say? That she had assumed Emma didn't matter because of the way she was dressed? That she had judged her by her appearance, without even giving her a chance? "I understand," Taylor mumbled, looking down at her hands, which were still trembling slightly. Mrs. Simmons wasn't finished. Her eyes softened slightly as she looked at Taylor, but the disappointment was clear in her voice. "Taylor, I've always prided myself on running this boutique with integrity and class. Our clientele come here not just for the clothes, but for the experience. And that experience includes being treated with respect, no matter who they are or what they look like." Taylor nodded, biting the inside of her cheek to keep from crying. She had worked so hard to climb the ladder at Silverline, and now it felt like all of that effort was crumbling beneath her feet. Mrs. Simmons' gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, as if she were deciding how much more to say. Finally, she sighed. "I'll talk to you more about this later," she said, her tone making it clear that this conversation was far from over. "For now, I suggest you take a break and come back with a clearer head." Taylor nodded again, not trusting herself to speak. She felt a wave of nausea roll through her as she watched Mrs. Simmons turn back to Emma, who was now admiring a nearby display of handbags. The two began chatting casually, their voices fading into the background as Taylor hurried toward the break room, desperate to escape the suffocating tension in the boutique. The moment she was behind the door, she slumped into a chair, her head falling into her hands. Her mind raced with a million thoughts, each one worse than the last. How could she have been so stupid? She had spent the entire afternoon ignoring someone who turned out to be the most important person in the store. She had misjudged Emma from the second she walked in, and now it was all coming back to bite her. Taylor's hands were still shaking as she grabbed her phone and scrolled through her messages, trying to distract herself from the mess she had just created. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that her career at Silverline was hanging by a thread. Mrs. Simmons hadn't outright said she was going to fire her, but the look in her eyes had been enough to plant that fear in Taylor's mind. She took a deep breath, her fingers clenching and unclenching around her phone. Maybe this could still be fixed. Maybe if she apologized, really apologized, Mrs. Simmons would understand. And maybe Emma, who seemed kind enough, would forgive her too. But as much as Taylor wanted to believe that, a sinking feeling told her it wouldn't be that simple. For the next half hour, Taylor sat alone in the break room, replaying every mistake she had made that day. She thought about how she had treated Emma like she didn't matter, how she had been so focused on impressing the wealthy clients that she had completely missed what was really important, treating everyone with the same respect. As she sat there, she realized that this wasn't just about Emma or Mrs. Simmons. This was about how she had been approaching her job for the past year. She had been so caught up in climbing the ladder, in trying to make sales and impress the right people, that she had forgotten the simple truth that her mother had always taught her: kindness costs nothing. Taylor closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could control what she did next. And if she had any hope of keeping her job and her dignity, she would have to start by owning up to her mistake. Meanwhile, out on the sales floor, Emma was still browsing, chatting with Mrs. Simmons as she casually picked up a few more items to try on. But despite the pleasant conversation, Emma couldn't help but feel a little guilty. She hadn't meant to cause any trouble for Taylor. She had seen the way the clerk had looked at her when she first walked in, like she didn't belong. It wasn't the first time Emma had been judged by her appearance, and she doubted it would be the last. But still, Emma couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Taylor was now facing some serious consequences because of her. She hadn't wanted things to turn out this way. All she had wanted was to quietly browse, maybe find something she liked, and leave. But now everything felt complicated. As she glanced at her aunt, who was busy inspecting a display of shoes, Emma made a quiet decision. She would talk to Taylor before she left, try to smooth things over. She knew her aunt was disappointed, but Emma wasn't the type to hold a grudge. Maybe, just maybe, she could help Taylor out of the mess she was in. The minutes dragged on as Taylor sat in the break room, the weight of her mistake pressing down on her like a heavy stone. Her thoughts swirled in a chaotic mess of panic, guilt, and fear. She had worked hard to establish herself at Silverline, and now it felt like all of that hard work had unraveled in just a few careless interactions. She stared blankly at her phone, the screen illuminating messages she couldn't focus on. Her mind was consumed by Mrs. Simmons' sharp words: respect, integrity, class. Words that Taylor had thought she embodied, until now. She had treated Emma as if she didn't belong, as if her value as a customer was defined by the price of her clothes, and now her narrow-minded actions were catching up with her. The door to the break room creaked open and Taylor jumped, her heart racing. She half expected to see Mrs. Simmons, ready to deliver the final blow to her career. But it was Janet, one of her co-workers, who stepped into the room. Janet was older, in her mid-40s, and had been working at the boutique far longer than Taylor. She was known for her motherly nature and her ability to sense when something was off. "Taylor," Janet began softly, her brow furrowing in concern, "Mrs. Simmons wants to see you in her office." Taylor's stomach flipped. This is it, she thought. I'm done. Her legs felt weak as she stood, and the walk from the break room to Mrs. Simmons' office felt like a death march. Her mind raced with potential excuses, explanations, anything that might save her job, but deep down, she knew none of it would matter. She had made a mistake, and now she would have to face the consequences. When she reached the office door, she hesitated for a brief second before knocking. Mrs. Simmons's voice called from the other side, calm but commanding, "Come in." Taylor pushed open the door and stepped inside. The office was impeccably neat, just like the rest of the store, modern, elegant, and minimalistic, with framed fashion photos adorning the walls. Mrs. Simmons sat behind her sleek glass desk, her expression unreadable. Taylor's heart pounded in her chest as she stood in front of her boss, desperately trying to keep her composure. "Sit down, Taylor," Mrs. Simmons said, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. Taylor did as she was told, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her like a thick fog. Mrs. Simmons' gaze was steady, and for a few long moments she said nothing. Taylor's fingers gripped the edges of her chair, her knuckles turning white as she braced herself for what was coming. "I've had time to think about what happened today," Mrs. Simmons began, her voice controlled, but with a cool edge to it. I've spoken with Emma and I've observed how you interacted with her earlier. I'm disappointed, Taylor. The words stung more than Taylor had anticipated. It was one thing to know you had messed up. It was another to have it laid out in front of you by the very person you wanted to impress. Mrs. Simmons continued, I've always told my employees that every customer who walks through those doors is important. It doesn't matter what they're wearing or how much money they appear to have. You should treat everyone with respect and kindness. That's part of what makes this boutique special. People come here for the service as much as they come for the products. Taylor nodded, but she couldn't find the words to respond. Everything Mrs. Simmons was saying made sense, and she knew she had fallen short of those expectations. I don't understand, Taylor, Mrs. Simmons said, leaning forward slightly, her eyes narrowing in disappointment. Why did you treat Emma like that? What made you think she wasn't worth your time? Taylor's mouth went dry. She had been dreading this question, and now it was staring her in the face. She knew she couldn't lie. Mrs. Simmons would see right through it. I made an assumption, Taylor admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought, because of the way she was dressed, that she wasn't going to buy anything. I was focused on another customer, someone who seemed more likely to make a purchase, and I didn't give Emma the attention she deserved. The truth felt heavy in her mouth, but at least it was out. Taylor's heart raced as she waited for Mrs. Simmons' response, half expecting her boss to explode in anger. But Mrs. Simmons remained calm, her eyes studying Taylor with a mixture of disappointment and sadness. You made an assumption, Mrs. Simmons repeated quietly. She leaned back in her chair, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. That's exactly the problem, Taylor. You judged someone based on their appearance. And in this business, that's the quickest way to lose a customer's trust. People come to Silverline because they expect more than just high-end fashion. They expect to be treated like they matter. Taylor swallowed hard, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She had let her ambition cloud her judgment, and now she was paying the price. I don't want to fire you, Mrs. Simmons continued, her voice softening just slightly. You've been a good employee for the most part, and I've seen potential in you. But this is a serious issue, and it's not something I can overlook. Taylor's heart lurched at the mention of being fired. She had been so sure that her job was on the line, but hearing Mrs. Simmons say she didn't want to fire her offered a tiny sliver of hope. Maybe there was still a chance to make things right. I understand, Taylor said, her voice trembling. I'm really sorry. I know I messed up, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. I want to learn from this. I don't want to be the kind of person who judges others like that. Mrs. Simmons' expression softened a little more. I appreciate that, Taylor, and I believe you're sincere, but actions speak louder than words. You need to show me and yourself that you're capable of treating every customer with the same respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. Taylor nodded quickly, eager to prove herself. I will. I promise. For a few moments, Mrs. Simmons was silent, her eyes distant as she considered her next words. Finally, she spoke. Here's what we're going to do. I'm not going to terminate your employment today. But I want you to think about this experience carefully. Moving forward, I'll be keeping a closer eye on your interactions with customers. I want to see real improvement, and if this kind of behavior happens again, there won't be another conversation. You'll be dismissed immediately. Taylor felt a wave of relief wash over her. She wasn't losing her job. Not yet, at least. She had been given a second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I won't let you down. Mrs. Simmons nodded, but her expression remained serious. One more thing. I want you to apologize to Emma before you leave today. I know she didn't ask for it, but it's the right thing to do. She deserves to hear it from you. Taylor's stomach flipped. She had been dreading this part. Facing Mrs. Simmons had been terrifying, but apologizing to Emma, the girl she had treated so poorly, felt even harder. Still, she knew it was necessary. Yes, of course, Taylor agreed quickly. I'll apologize. Mrs. Simmons nodded, satisfied. Good, now, take a few minutes to collect yourself, and when you're ready, find Emma and make things right. The weight of the conversation with Mrs. Simmons still lingered in Taylor's chest as she stepped out of the office. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the nerves wouldn't fade. She wasn't fired, that was a relief, but her future at Silverline was hanging by a thread, and that thread depended on her ability to make things right. And it all started with Emma. Taylor glanced around the store. The bright lights and pristine displays seemed to mock her, like they belonged to a world she was no longer sure she fit into. Everything had felt so certain this morning. She was good at her job, confident in her ability to charm the right customers. But now that certainty was gone. She had learned today just how fragile her position really was and how easily one mistake could unravel everything. Her eyes scanned the boutique, and there was Emma, still browsing through the racks of clothes with a calm, quiet demeanor. She looked so at ease, as if nothing had happened, as if Taylor's earlier dismissal had left no lasting impact. But Taylor knew better. Just because Emma hadn't made a scene didn't mean she hadn't been hurt by the way she was treated. The knot in Taylor's stomach tightened. Apologizing wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. She owed Emma an apology, not just because Miss Simmons had instructed her to do so, but because Taylor knew it was the right thing to do. Steeling herself, she walked toward Emma, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached, Emma looked up, her warm brown eyes meeting Taylor's with a kindness that only made the situation harder. "Hey," Taylor started, her voice small and hesitant. Emma smiled at her, as if she wasn't about to get an apology from the very person who had brushed her off earlier. "Hi," Emma replied softly, her tone light and casual. There was no trace of resentment or anger in her voice, which only made Taylor feel more ashamed. Taylor took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. She couldn't let this moment pass without owning up to her mistake. I wanted to say I'm really sorry," she said, her voice shaky but sincere. "For the way I treated you earlier, I was rude and I didn't give you the respect you deserved. I made assumptions based on things I shouldn't have, and I feel terrible about it." Emma's face softened, her smile never wavering. She seemed to consider Taylor's words for a moment before speaking. "Thank you for saying that," she said gently. "It's easy to make assumptions. We all do it sometimes, but I appreciate you owning up to it." Taylor nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. Emma was being far more understanding than she deserved, and it only made her regret her earlier actions even more. "It wasn't fair of me," Taylor continued, her words spilling out in a rush. "You didn't deserve to be treated like that. I've just been so focused on the wrong things. Trying to impress the customers I thought were important, but I forgot that everyone is important." Emma's smile grew a little wider, and she nodded. "I get it. Working in retail is hard. There's a lot of pressure, especially in a place like this, but it's good that you've recognized it." For a moment, the two of them stood there, the tension easing into something more like understanding. Taylor felt a small weight lift from her shoulders, though the guilt still lingered. She knew this apology wouldn't magically erase what had happened, but it was a step in the right direction. Emma broke the silence, her tone light and encouraging. "Hey, don't beat yourself up too much. We all have our moments, and for what it's worth, I think you're doing great here. This is a tough environment to work in, but you're handling it." Taylor blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected such kindness from Emma, especially after how she had treated her earlier. The words hit her in a way she hadn't anticipated, filling her with a strange sense of gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a lot." Emma smiled again, glancing around the store. "I actually do like this place," she admitted, her tone playful. "You've got some amazing stuff here." Taylor laughed lightly, the tension between them fully dissolving. It was the first time all day she had felt anything close to relief. "Yeah, we do," she said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Let me know if you need help finding anything. Seriously this time." Emma chuckled. "I'll let you know," she teased, before turning her attention back to a rack of blouses. Taylor stood there for a moment, watching her browse, the knot in her stomach loosening as the conversation replayed in her head. Emma had been gracious, far more gracious than she deserved, and Taylor was grateful for it. But the real work wasn't done. She had a lot to prove, not just to Mrs. Simmons, but to herself. She took a deep breath, gathering herself before returning to her duties. Every time she caught a glimpse of Emma browsing through the store, a part of her still felt the sting of shame. But now there was also a sense of hope. This wasn't the end. It was a chance to do better, to become the kind of person she wanted to be. As the afternoon wore on, Taylor made a point of treating every customer who walked through the door with the same level of care and attention. It didn't matter if they were wearing designer clothes or a simple hoodie. Each one deserved respect. She greeted each person with warmth, her attitude a stark contrast to the way she had started her shift that morning. A few hours later, the store began to wind down, and Taylor noticed Emma heading toward the counter. She had picked out a few items, a blouse, a scarf, and a simple silver necklace. Nothing extravagant, but clearly things she had thought carefully about. Taylor rang up the items, her hands steady now, the earlier anxiety replaced by a calm determination. As she handed Emma the bag, she smiled genuinely. "Thank you for shopping with us today, Emma." Emma smiled back, her eyes twinkling with that same warmth. "Thanks for all your help, Taylor." With that, Emma turned and left the store, the soft chime of the doorbell signaling her departure. Taylor watched her go, feeling a strange mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, and the sense that she had learned something important today. As she stood there, Mrs. Simmons approached from the back of the store, her expression more relaxed than it had been earlier. She glanced toward the door where Emma had just exited, then back at Taylor. "Well?" Mrs. Simmons asked, a hint of curiosity in her voice. "How did it go?" Taylor took a deep breath, then smiled. "I think I'm starting to understand what you mean," she said quietly, her voice steady. "About how it's not just about the clothes or the sales, it's about how we treat people." Mrs. Simmons studied her for a moment, her sharp eyes softening just a little. "Good," she said simply. "That's what I wanted to hear." The two women stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the day finally lifting. Taylor knew she still had a lot to prove, but this was a start. She had been given a second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. As the last customers filtered out of the boutique and the store prepared to close for the evening, Taylor couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet resolve. She wasn't just going to be good at her job. She was going to be better. And this time, she wouldn't forget the lesson she had learned from Emma. That kindness, respect, and humility were far more important than any sales commission could ever be. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.